Once upon a time, in the beautiful city of Ibadan, there lived a boy named Teo, who never regarded others. He was so rude and disrespectful that people shook their heads whenever he walked by. He would beat up his poor grandmother whenever she tried to correct him, and even left home for days as a way of punishing her, knowing how worried she would be when he didn't return. Teo's mother had died while giving birth to him, and her mother took on the responsibility of raising him. However, owing to the way his mother died, his grandmother did all she could to avoid situations that would make him miss his dead mother. As a result, she allowed him to get away with many unruly behaviors. As Teo began to grow, he became increasingly disrespectful and out of control. She would cry herself to sleep every night, praying that her grandson would one day change his ways. But Teo was not ready to change. He always got himself into trouble that often required his grandmother to spend huge amounts of money to bail him out. One morning, as Teo strolled into the nearby market, he saw an old woman selling oranges by the roadside. Without asking, he grabbed some oranges and stuffed them into his bag. The old woman pleaded with him to pay for the fruits. "My son, please pay. These oranges are all that I have," she said to Teo. Teo laughed in her face and asked what she was going to do if he refused to pay. "What will you do if I don't pay? Will you come and take them from me?" he asked mockingly. Then he kicked her basket with his foot. Oranges scattered across the dusty road as the old woman fell to her knees and began picking them up with trembling hands. People in the market gathered around and began shouting angrily at Teo. "Shame on you, Teo. Have you no heart?" But Teo did not care. He bit into one of the oranges and walked away, laughing without a care. Teo was extremely stubborn. He had no respect for anyone and believed he was untouchable because of the kind of friends he kept. Once, he laughed at an old man crossing the road with a walking stick. Teo continued mocking the elderly man, imitating his slow, shaky movement, and laughing so loudly that passers-by stared in disbelief. "Look at him," Teo shouted. "Is he walking or dancing?" The old man, hurt but calm, paused and looked at Teo with sad eyes. "Young boy, remember this day. Every action has its consequences. You cannot run from them forever," he said. Teo only rolled his eyes and walked away. Teo had no respect for anyone, and his grandmother bore the brunt of his cruelty daily. One evening, Teo's grandmother managed to save a small amount of money after weeks of hard labor. She hid it under her mattress, hoping to buy food and medicine. However, Teo discovered the money and stole it. He used it to gamble with his friends. When his grandmother confronted him tearfully, he yelled at her angrily. "What were you planning to do with that little change? Is it because of that money that you're stressing me out?" he asked. His grandmother broke down in tears, knowing she had no money left to feed them for the rest of the week. All she had worked for was gone in a flash, and the realization that her grandson was leading a destructive life broke her. That night, Teo's grandmother knelt by her bedside, tears streaming down her face. She lifted her trembling hands to the heavens and cried out, "Oh God, please touch my grandson's heart. Let him see the error of his ways before it's too late." But Teo, oblivious to his grandmother's pain, was out with his friends gambling and drinking without a single care in the world. The next evening, Teo and his friends passed by the mortuary at Ring Road. He dared them to sneak inside, not caring how sacred the place was. "Let's go and see the dead bodies. I hear they keep them stacked like firewood," Teo said, laughing as the others joined in. Always eager to prove how brave he was, Teo convinced them to sneak into the mortuary. They entered through the back door, and an unsettling silence filled the space. Metal tables lined the room, and lifeless bodies lay covered with white sheets. Instead of feeling fear or respect for the dead, Teo began to laugh hysterically. "Look at them. Stiff like dried fish. What a waste," he said, pulling back one of the white sheets to mock the lifeless body of a woman beneath. The mortuary attendant, hearing strange noises, walked in and saw Teo laughing and mocking the dead. "Young man," the attendant said quietly, his voice filled with anger, "you have mocked the dead today, but mark my words, the dead do not forget. Leave this place now before I call the authorities." Teo and his friends burst into laughter, completely ignoring the warning. "Old man, go back to your ghosts. You can't scare us," Teo sneered, waving his hand dismissively. As they turned to leave, Teo stopped in his tracks, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. He turned back to the lifeless body of the woman he had mocked earlier. "Look at her lying there like she owns the place," he said mockingly. Then, in an act of sheer disrespect, Teo touched the woman's breast, laughing loudly as his friends gasped in shock. The mortuary attendant's face went pale, and he murmured under his breath, "May the dead have mercy on you, boy." The group ran out of the mortuary, still chuckling, but a strange silence seemed to follow them into the bustling streets of Ibadan. That night, Teo could not sleep. His room, usually warm and stuffy, felt ice-cold. He tossed and turned on his thin mattress, his eyes darting nervously around the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint whisper. "Teo!" He sat up, sweat dripping from his head. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You are mine," the voice said. Terrified, Teo turned on the light, but no one was there. "Was I dreaming?" he asked himself. Just then, he felt a hot slap across his face. He immediately lost his ability to speak. His mouth felt numb, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't utter a single word. Teo, now mute and terrified, staggered to his grandmother's room. His trembling hands clutched the doorframe, and saliva dripped uncontrollably from his mouth. His grandmother sat up in alarm when she saw him standing there, his wide eyes filled with terror and his lips quivering as if trying to form words. "Teo, what's wrong? Talk to me," she cried, rushing to him. But Teo could only make incoherent sounds, his mouth refusing to obey him. His grandmother grabbed his face, her eyes scanning it with concern. "Did someone hurt you? Teo, speak to me." He shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. His grandmother, now panicked, led him to sit on the edge of her bed, praying softly under her breath. "God of mercy, whatever is wrong with my grandson, please have mercy. Please, Lord." That night, Teo sat by his grandmother's side, unable to sleep, unable to speak, and unable to escape the oppressive cold that seemed to cling to his skin. The next morning, word spread around the neighborhood that Teo had lost his ability to speak. His friends from the mortuary incident came to visit him, their faces pale with fear. One of them whispered, "This isn't normal. That mortuary attendant warned us. I knew we shouldn't have gone there." But this was only the beginning of Teo's torment. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the dead woman, her pale skin and hollow eyes staring at him, her lips moving silently. Objects in their small home began to move on their own. Plates fell from shelves, the door creaked open at night, and shadows danced in corners where they shouldn't have been. Even his grandmother began to hear whispers in her sleep, faint voices calling Teo's name. As the days passed, Teo's condition worsened. He lost so much weight due to his inability to eat properly. People began to gossip, wondering what had happened to him. Some believed he had contracted a deadly disease, while others were convinced he was cursed. They mocked him, and Teo, feeling dejected, began to live a life of isolation. His grandmother did everything she could to help him, but nothing worked. All the doctors who examined him found nothing physically wrong. As Teo's condition worsened, his grandmother grew desperate. His frail body was barely able to move, and his once proud and loud demeanor was now reduced to hollow stares and incoherent sobs. One evening, a kind elderly neighbor named Mama visited Teo's grandmother. She had heard the gossip about Teo's encounter with the dead woman at the mortuary and came to offer advice. "My sister, this is not an ordinary sickness," Mama said firmly. "Take your grandson back to where this problem started. The dead do not forgive easily when disrespected." Teo's grandmother nodded in agreement. The next morning, they arrived at the mortuary and met the attendant, Baba Deji, the same man who had warned Teo about his reckless behavior. Baba Deji stood at the entrance of the mortuary as though he had been waiting for them. His sharp eyes scanned Teo's trembling body, and he shook his head in disappointment. "I warned you, young man," Baba Deji said in a low voice. "You mocked the dead, and now you have awakened something that cannot be easily silenced." Teo's grandmother fell to her knees, pleading with Baba Deji. "Please, Baba, help my grandson. Whatever it takes, we will do it." Please don't let him die like this. Baba Deji sighed deeply and gestured for them to follow him inside. They were led to a small room lined with old shelves and flickering candles. Baba Deji sat on a wooden stool and muttered a few words under his breath. He then looked directly at Teo and began to speak. I have a gift, he began, a gift that allows me to speak to spirits caught between this world and the next. The woman you disrespected, her spirit has spoken to me. Teo's grandmother gasped, clutching her chest, while her grandson stared blankly, his hollow eyes fixed on Baba Deji. The woman you mocked and touched was not just any corpse, Baba Deji continued. Her name was Abini. She died with deep sorrow in her heart. She had no family, no husband, and no children. She passed away from a broken heart, carrying the weight of loneliness into the grave. Her spirit cannot find rest because she was denied love and companionship in life. Baba Deji's voice dropped lower. She has chosen you, Teo, to be. Teo's grandmother gasped again, her hand flying to her mouth. What do you mean, Baba? My son is supposed to marry a dead woman? Baba Deji nodded solemnly. It is the only way. Abini's spirit has demanded marriage. Teo must marry her, give her a proper burial with honor, and visit her grave regularly as her husband. Only then will her spirit rest. And only then will Teo be freed from this curse. Teo's grandmother wept bitterly, her frail body shaking as she clutched her son's hands. Teo, unable to speak, let out a muffled sob as tears rolled down his face. Baba Deji advised them to seek out Abini's family, if any existed, so that they could be informed and give their blessing. After days of inquiry within the community and speaking with elders, it was confirmed that Abini had no living family members. She had been an only child, abandoned by distant relatives, and had died alone in a small rented room. The weight of loneliness and betrayal had taken her to the grave. Realizing there was no family to give their blessings, Baba Deji told them that the marriage must proceed without delay. Under Baba Deji's guidance, preparations began. A small white wedding gown was placed over Abini's lifeless body, and her hair was adorned with flowers. Teo, weak and trembling, was dressed in a white agbada representing purity and submission. Baba Deji began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the cold mortuary room. Abini, daughter of the earth, you are not forgotten. Today, you are honored. Today, you are loved. He guided Teo to kneel beside Abini's body, and with a trembling hand, Teo placed a ring on her lifeless finger. A cold breeze swept through the room, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the air was filled with a faint, sorrowful sigh. Baba Deji sprinkled holy water and salt over Abini's body and whispered final blessings. It is done. Her spirit is now at peace. The next day, a proper burial ceremony was held for Abini. A small gathering of people attended, led by Baba Deji. Abini was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery at the outskirts of Ibadan. Still weak but able to whisper faint words, Teo stood beside her grave. I am so sorry, Abini, for disrespecting you. May you find the peace that you were denied in life. He placed fresh white flowers on her grave and walked away with his grandmother, his head bowed low. Baba Deji warned Teo. Although Abini is now at rest, your connection to her is forever. As her husband, you are obligated to visit her grave occasionally, bringing fresh flowers and whispering prayers for her soul. If you neglect her grave, if you forget your promise, the curse will return, even stronger. Teo nodded solemnly, knowing that he could never escape his obligation. In the months that followed, Teo transformed into a completely different person. He became quiet, humble, and deeply respectful of others. He worked hard to support his grandmother and apologized to her for all that he had done to her. Teo also strolled to the market to find the old woman whose oranges he had tossed to the ground some months ago. He found her by the corner and apologized for how he had treated her on that fateful day. The old woman looked up at him, tears streaming down her eyes. She forgave him for all that he had done, and Teo thanked her for her kindness. He handed her some money as payment for the oranges, and the old woman was so grateful that she began to bless him fervently. Every month, without fail, Teo visited Abini's grave. He placed fresh flowers on the grave and whispered prayers for her. People in the community began to notice the change in him. They spoke in hushed tones about the boy who had once mocked the dead but was now living a changed life. Teo has changed, they would say, revealing how the dead had taught him a lesson that he would never forget. And Teo truly never forgot. For the rest of his life, he carried the weight of his actions and the memory of Abini, the bride he never truly knew but was forever bound to in spirit. In the quiet cemetery at the edge of Ibadan, a gravestone stood with the words, "Abini, beloved and remembered, rest in peace." Every month, a young man named Teo would kneel before it, honoring a promise made in fear but kept in love. The lesson to be learned from this story is that every action, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, carries consequences. Teo's reckless behavior brought about a curse that cost him his peace, his health, and nearly his life. The story serves as a warning that actions done in arrogance and ignorance often lead to regret. Despite Teo's horrible actions, he was given a chance to make amends and change his life. His transformation into a humble, kind-hearted man proves that people can change when they truly acknowledge their wrongs. I hope you learned something from this story. Please, if you haven't subscribed, kindly click on the subscribe button. Be a part of my growth. Turn on the notifications so that when I post more interesting stories, you'll be the first to get them. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for your consistent support.